Well, welcome to Grow Big Red, the show from Nebraska Extension that talks about gardening. I'm John Porter, and I'm joined by my colleague John Fesh, and we're going to talk about several different things for the spring garden today. But I wanted to start off, we have this beautiful container in front of me, and we're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about the beauty, but first we're going to talk about the devastation. The issue that we've had recently with the flooding in Nebraska and Iowa, and a lot of the questions that we've been getting in our offices have been to do with safety and flooding. And one of the issues that a lot of people may not think about is the issue of food safety from the vegetable garden. We get a lot of questions about, can I plant in my garden or can I not? And so that's one question that we get. We have a few answers for, and one of the potential alternatives is container gardening. So that's where we're making that connection today.
Yeah, and container gardening is a great option for those areas that have been flooded. Places around Fremont and Ashland and those kind of locations. And it's also a good location or a good option for people who just have small spaces. You know, if you just have a patio or a balcony and you maybe live in a townhouse or a condo. So it's applicable in both of those situations. And you can have an edible or an ornamental garden as a container garden. So it's a great topic to talk about here in the spring.
Right, so when we talk about the flooding and the food safety issues, you'll notice in this container, I'll actually point out what we have in here. So a lot of the stuff are the early spring, cool season crops that I've intermixed with some edible flowers, some pansies. But we have some lettuces, we have kale, here's another lettuce. And then coming up later in the season, it's not quite big enough yet, but I can harvest a little bit here, is a little Swiss chard. So that
little tasting too?
We could have a tasting,
All
yeah.
right.
So yeah, so there we go. So does Mikey like it?
John likes it.
Okay, well there we go.
Very flavorful.
So one of the issues around food safety is a waiting period between when the flooding ends and whenever you can start harvesting crops from that land that was flooded. Right. And we have that waiting period is mainly because of all the pathogens that we think are most likely in the water. And so if it is one of these crops like these leafy greens, it comes in direct contact with the soil. Right. So the waiting period for that is a little bit longer. It's actually 120 days. Right. So 120 days from when the flood water recedes to when you can have a reduced risk. We're never going to say it's like completely safe. Yeah. A reduced risk of pathogens from that produce in the garden. If it was produce that didn't touch the soil, let's say we had like a tomato or a pepper that we had staked up and the tomatoes didn't touch the soil, it's 90 days. So we can get by with tomatoes. You could still plant tomatoes potentially in that ground if it's not still too mucky and wet and still workable. Yeah. But you're not going to have time between the end of the flood and when you would need to plant and harvest the lettuce and stuff, because it's just, the season will be over. It'll be too warm for that.
What about a fall crop though, John? Let's say you wanted to plant some things in, say, September or late September. Could we have a fall garden with these leafy greens?
You could. So that's the one thing that I think that a lot of people, they think, you know, they've been sort of trained to garden on a calendar, right? Yeah. It is Mother's Day. I'm going to go plant my garden. Right. Every time I ask the question, when are you going to plant your garden, I get that answer, that it is Mother's Day. Yeah. And really, number one, we're trying to get people away from the calendar thought and into looking at the actual temperatures and the weather. But number two, all of these leafy greens, they make great cool season crops. Right. And so planting them again in August, September, right, they will actually be happier, because right now, if we plant them in April or May, we're planting them when it's nice and cool, but it keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and they get unhappier and unhappier. Yeah. Right? They start to bolt, so they'll flower, they'll become bitter and not tasty. We'll have all kinds of insect problems that come out. So if we wait and plant some more in the fall, they actually do a little bit better. And that's especially true for like the cole crops, like broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower. We want to go and plant them in May when we plant our tomatoes. And number one, that's too late for spring planting. Yeah. They need to be planted earlier. But also, as it gets warmer, they don't perform well. So doing this in the fall, or container gardening in the fall, or planting in the garden in the fall is perfect.
So there is sort of if there is sort of a silver lining to the cloud of the flood, it may just be an encouragement to push some of these crops off to the fall.
Yeah, so you can plant those in the fall. That's one of the alternatives is just waiting, extending that waiting period.
Right.
And that waiting period is actually based on recommendations around applying manures to the garden. We don't, there's not a lot of research out there that says, exactly after the flood, this is exactly what you have to do and what you have to wait, because we can't create a flood and then go research it. And so this is based on the research that talks about if we apply a raw manure product, like if I were a gardener or a farmer and I went to my neighbor who had cattle and I got their manure, how long does it take for the pathogens above the soil level to break down? They persist much longer below the soil level.
But I think it's a good comparison because you're talking about raw sewage,
right,
and dead animals that would have been associated with a flood. And when that material does get deposited on a vegetable garden or an area that has been gardened for a while, the assumption is pretty strong that E. coli and listeria and other undesirable pathogens are in that area. And so cautious is certainly the word of the day there.
Right. The other question we get is, can I test my soil for contaminants after the flood? And unfortunately, the pathogens will dissipate as they're exposed to the elements. A lot of the chemical things that might be in the water, they actually are diluted a lot with the flood water. If you think about it, the E. coli, once it's in place, if it's happy, it will grow and there will be more, it will reproduce. Whereas the chemical contamination, the more it's diluted, and the more it washes off through the rain. And if you wanted to test, you actually have to know what you want to test for.
Right.
You can't just go, you could have your soil tested for any potential chemical contaminant, but you would probably pay thousands of dollars to a lab to do that. So basically we say that, as time passes, we have this waiting period so that things can wash out of the soil and they can break down when they're exposed to the sun and to the rain and the wind and all that.
Yeah, I think the outdoor elements, the sun and temperatures, are the best thing. In addition to that, the solution to pollution is dilution.
That's what they told me in organic chemistry class.
There you
we
go.
were told to, flush our chemicals down the sink.
And we certainly had a lot of dilution.
Yes.
A lot of water on that. And again, we know that we've possibly gotten some drift or movement of farm chemicals, the ones used for corn and soybeans and things like that, maybe atrazine and some of those other materials off onto the garden. The other problem with testing is the garden is not homogeneous. The garden is not the same, and we don't know where these possible contaminants were deposited and where they weren't. Also, a lot of silt and sand was deposited there, and they have the different capacity to hold onto or absorb those different materials as well. So testing is theoretically possible, but when it comes to practically, not so much.
Right. So we have these nice cool season plants in here, but these are going to be done in the short term. They're not going to last until when it gets hot. So if I wanted to just continue my container gardening in the warm season, we could talk about what can I plant in a container that is edible or ornamental or mixed. So I like to play with my food. So it's like there's these beautiful qualities of the lettuces and stuff. So it's still ornamental.
Right.
And we can talk about designing a container. If you've ever went to a container designing workshop, you have like the thriller and the filler and the spiller, right? That's how you add drama to the container.
Right.
But in the summer, we can incorporate those things that we like tomatoes and eggplants and all that. And they're actually, so you need a big container if you want to grow like a beefsteak tomato, 5-gallon bucket plus, right? But the neat thing is that a lot of the breeders are coming out with dwarf and miniature sizes of these crops. So some of the ones that we're testing out and we have people growing are, there's one called a patio baby eggplant.
Excellent.
And the eggplant gets 2 feet tall, and it has little baby, individual sized eggplants on it. There are dwarf tomatoes. We have one that is patio choice yellow. Mm-hmm. It's a cherry tomato, and the plant only gets 18 inches tall. So, thinking about, you can find these small plants to stick in there, you can find the other warm season stuff, but you can have, a mix of different things in your containers. It doesn't have to be all one thing.
Yeah, I think it's great the way you're testing this. This is part of a program called the All America Selections, and it's something that gardeners can look for. There's a little tag that says All America Selections, AAS, on it when you go to the garden center, and that's sort of an assurance of quality. It's not a guarantee that it's going to work out perfectly, but these have been tested across the United States. I remember when I worked for the University of Illinois, we had an AAS testing garden, and they'd look at all kinds of annual flowers, perennial flowers, as well as the vegetables. And they're really just trying to select the best of the best.
Right, so that's one of the programs that we really enjoy doing. We test out all different kinds of things, and so we'll have more recommendations coming up in the next year as we test out what we're growing right now. But just to recap, what we've sort of talked about today, we've talked about there's that waiting period for food safety after your vegetable garden site has flooded. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to come from a stream. That recommendation also is like if you have heavy rain and you have just pooling water in your garden, we can't guarantee where that water came from. So we want to have that waiting period of 90 days if it's a crop that doesn't touch the soil, 120 days if it does touch the soil. So that could eliminate for this season some of those early spring crops that you would put out. But the alternative is container gardening. So we can grow lots of those different things in containers. For example, my lettuces and kale and Swiss chard that are mixed here with some pansies. So you can mix in some ornamental elements, but those are also edible as well. So we didn't have a taste test on that, right?
What do you think?
It's very, it doesn't taste like anything.
Oh, nondescript?
Nondescript.
But beautiful.
It's, it'll go in a salad. It'll make a salad pretty. So you can play with your food. You can do a little ornamental changing around there and adding some different things to the container, and then also thinking about delaying that until the fall.
So containers for the summer, and all sorts of things for the fall. And it's just good, like you said, the calendar is not associated with a plant. The plant doesn't have a mind. The calendar, doesn't read a calendar, doesn't look at our books. They pay attention to sunlight, temperature, and moisture, and they respond well to that.
Right. So I think we'll call it a day on this, and
all right.
So we'll get out and we'll have our pansy and lettuce salad.
Very good, and if you have other questions, you can always contact John or myself at the Nebraska Extension Office in Douglas and Sarpy counties. We're located in kind of the geographic center of the counties at 80th and West Center Road, and you can call us at 444-7804.
Right.
All right, thanks for watching on Grow Big Red.